Oh, hello! Look at us ready for round 3.
Round 3, fight!
My name is Carrie, and today we're going to take what we've done so far and push it in a whole new direction. You're going to have to pull out some actual materials for this one, maybe even writing utensils.
A handbag?
No, what? When did I even say handbag? What a weirdo. Just pencils, maybe some brushes and stuff. But before we get there, I'll run through my part of round 2 to see if it gives you any ideas. We had expanded out to using color, flat color, gradients, or stuff airbrushed in. And this one was harder for me because I was challenged to think about color way more than I usually do. So that's great because, you know what, I found out some things I never would have otherwise. This first one started off in Illustrator in black and white, just trying to make a sort of hypnotic tunnel like in the first round. You know, first attempt, kind of repeating myself, no real ground broken, nothing amazing. And I was thinking I'd just add color afterward because, in all honesty, I'm terrible at thinking of color as a fundamental part of the image. Super simple to slather it on after the fact, right? So I brought the shapes into Photoshop and went out and grabbed something from that colorful gradients tumbler, and it didn't suddenly become awesome to my utter astonishment. So I tried to make it more interesting by painting in more contrasting values, bright along these edges and dark along these. And that helps a little bit because it starts to feel like lighting, which introduces a bit more depth. But overall, I thought maybe I should start over and that I could come back to this one, and I just moved on to number 2. Now, in realizing just how bad my habits with color are, I decided to keep this one really simple. So I made this big center triangle, echoed it, and brought in some color right from the start. And I was surprised just how much I liked big, simple shapes with a saturated color wash over the top. That might seem kind of dumb, but weirdly, I've never bothered to make anything this way before. I never thought to because I never had to. I mean, it's really simplistic, but for what it is, it's a nice setup. The color is basically in the purples and magentas up top, transitioning more into blues or cyans on bottom, which provides some variation. And each of these shapes are delineated by shifts in value. In this case, they get brighter as you move outward. But they're also delineated by some darks, what are effectively drop shadows that punch up that value contrast along the edges. Painting in some highlights here increases the value contrast even more, and the combination of all those things with the decreasing scale of the shapes generates some depth. It's not meant to have a lot of movement, but it succeeds elsewhere, so it's not terrible, you know? The only real problem I had with it is that, for technical reasons, I was getting some really bad banding. So I threw in a little bit of noise on top to quiet that down. And I admit, that's kind of cheating because noise is neither triangle nor color wash, and it honestly does change the quality a bit, right? It introduces some kind of tactility, a kind of paperiness. And that paperiness, in the context of these shapes and these colors with this kind of airbrush treatment, it bears a little bit of reference to stuff from the late 70s, early 80s. Not a ton, but some. And that's kind of cool for various reasons, even though it's sort of cheating. But I'm just going to take it. And this isn't an Olympic competition. You're not going to get busted for doping. The constraints are absolutely there for a reason, but those reasons are all for your own benefit. And I had a couple of epiphanies while doing this, which is kind of the benefit you'd hope to get. And if I'm not selling you on all my justifications for cheating and it still seems like I'm a huge liar, you can eat my It's staying in there. Also, it's done. Eat my So wanting to explore making that kind of thing some more, this one started pretty much the same way.
Here we go!
And for the most part, ended the same way. The only difference is this carryover idea from the last round of the tiny bits breaking away. Nothing particularly interesting happening in any of these first 3, although this one does have some very basic movement or direction because, you know, there's effectively a giant arrow here, which pulls your eye into this area. And then the little bits pull it even more specifically right here. But then there's not much else out here to alternately look at, so it's kind of a dead end where movement is concerned. There's also not a lot of depth, but flat is its own choice too. Like any of the contrasts, you may not want or need huge contrasts in depth. I generally like it, but personally, in these first few, it was really just nice to have found some uses for lots of color that came so simply. So these relatively minimal compositions were really welcome for me. Also, even without the noise, the sharp geometries and kind of sunset colors with this airbrush effect still feels sort of 80s, which isn't something I go for normally. So I feel like I found something out here, and it's something I enjoy. And it wasn't just about making 80s airbrush references. It felt like fertile ground in general, and that's something worth exploring. These are both simple, minimalist, if you want to call them that. I mean, that term fits here. Now, is minimalism necessarily good? That, of course, isn't really a question you can answer until you know what the goal of the imagery is. And above and beyond simply identifying and utilizing the basic contrast we've talked about so far, we're not really defining goals just yet. So you can decide for yourself what the goal might be for any of these frames. Now, depending on how you're most comfortable working, that might make things more difficult for you. What works for me with a less defined or more open challenge like this is to start in some random place, keeping my expectations loose until I see a possible direction emerging, and then make a conscious decision to push it further in that particular direction. Call back to the idea of using various forms of internal logic. But when you have limited time, that strategy is, of course, a bit of a gamble. With these two, nothing really jumped out at me in the 20 or 25 minutes I gave to each, so I didn't actually make it to the point where I started pushing toward anything in particular with a lot of intent. I think you can sort of glean that from looking at them. There's nothing wrong with them per se, they're technically proficient, but you can also kind of feel that they're aimless. Again, that's still totally okay. At this point in our project, the compositions we make don't need to feel important or full of intent, but really the ability to introduce warmth and coolness or whatever color moods you like, and the ability to increase or decrease the contrast in values. All that means that you're probably not making anything profound, but you can start intentionally aiming for things like mood. And it is helpful at this point to start recognizing or identifying your own intentionality. The core goal right now is to shift our thinking a little to look at things in terms of visual contrasts. And in doing so, figure out how to use them to move the eye, to create areas of interest, to delineate shapes, create variety, hierarchy, all that stuff. And that's great in and of itself. But it's also good at this point to start noticing the difference between when you're pushing shapes around aimlessly and when you're deliberately trying to do something simple like direct attention to an element or get the eye moving between points of interest or to develop and accentuate a mood. It's good to start being aware of whether you do or don't have reasons, whether whatever you're doing at some particular moment is for a purpose, however basic. And noting how things change for you when what you're doing is less of a random move and more aimed at something you're actually trying to do. Here's a good example. In this one, I picked a different gradient and basically just went for the same strategy at the start. Try some random stuff out and see where it goes. Now, the layout of the shapes isn't necessarily anything special, just something simple and symmetrical again. But I painted in some darker values like a drop shadow, and then in addition to the small shifts in hue from the gradients and shifts in value from darkening some of these shapes, some lighting cues start coming out. A little bit of depth, or rather contrasts in the depths at which certain elements sit in the frame, if you want to be a stickler. So it feels like there are layers of things here at different depths. Just a little something I had started to aim for. Something very basic, but intentional. Then these textures were introduced, just built out of tight grids of triangles. And they're only at like 20% opacity because I was just more interested in trying out relatively softer compositions at that moment. But they do create just enough of a subtle textural contrast to help differentiate these shapes from one another. And then these thin accents echo and reinforce the main blocky shapes. And in addition to providing a little contrast in both scale and line quality from their thinness or fragility, They're also bunched up into areas where they can help increase the density of detail in those areas. Lower density, relatively higher density. And having that density present in the form of these big, relatively empty areas with concentrated areas of thin lines, I decided to make more intentional moves toward that, to deliberately create an area of density right at the center with more thin lines to contrast that. And I ended up blowing past the whole timer thing, but only because I was having fun with it. Overall, it's kind of delicate and it's not particularly focused on movement, but it does draw the eye to the center where there's a higher density of things to look at. And it keeps using those thin lines to help with that, which I really like. And for the relatively short amount of time I put into it, I found some small goals to work for, went for it, and I think it turned out as a result. And having done that one, it seemed like it was time to, venture into different territory. Terrible territory, apparently. Garbage dump territory. A hot, musty, boring garbage dump full of sadness and crushed dreams. And pickles. Rotten pickles. You probably didn't even think pickles could rot, did you? But now you do. Just cracked open the old After Effects and tried to get tricky with some particle system stuff, and out came a moldy garbage dump pickle. My apologies to your eyes. So to take another crack at that, what's the word for, is it failed? I think it's pronounced failed.
Failed.
Okay, it's not a total garbage dump, but it's kind of a hot, wet mess as it stands, right? At this point, I'd been pushing my brain out of its comfort zone for a while and was starting to feel a little gassed. And when you're doing this sort of thing, if you're pushing yourself, that's going to happen, like a lot. So maybe at that point, it's time to take a little break. Step away for a bit and do something completely unrelated. Play with a dog, or drink a swampy health juice thing from some hipster place with lawn clippings in it. Or go plow quarters into the only remaining arcade version of Street Fighter 2 in town. Sweet! And when it's time to come back to it, there may be some familiar feelings tagging along. Maybe you're a little gassed in general from all the effort. Maybe you want to procrastinate a little bit, and then a little bit more. Maybe you've got the sinking feeling that you're just going to make something else that won't work. Now, that's just apprehension, and here's the deal with all that.
Listen here, you beautiful bitch. I'm about to fuck you up with some truth.
When you're apprehensive, there's an opportunity to learn, so keep going. When you feel like you can't do it, that's when you're about to learn. Keep going. When it's frustrating, you are learning. Keep going. When you make it and it's terrible, of course you're learning then too, so keep going. The thing is, our brains are actually built to seek certainty. They evolve that way. I don't want to take a huge tangent off into neuroscience, but it's interesting to note that the older part of our brains, the lizard brain as it were, reacts to uncertainty with fear. Oh, don't do that. It might be dangerous. You don't know, so it's not worth the risk. Don't get us killed over this. Just run away. That part of our brain evolved hundreds of millions of years ago to keep us alive in a time when we were dumb as rocks and actual death was coming from all angles. So it makes every kind of sense to run from what you're unsure of toward what you are sure of, to be strongly compelled away from anything remotely unknown, to fear certainty and crave safety. That's the older half of your brain, and among other things, it evolved to keep you alive in spite of your dumbest impulses. That part of your brain speaks almost exclusively in the language of emotions, so it has an intense grip on how you behave when it thinks it needs to. Because as far as it's concerned, your survival may depend on it. Other parts of your brain that have evolved more recently, like not literally a billion years ago, don't bear that weight of simply keeping you from petting a mountain lion or sticking your face in molten lava or seeing if you can breathe salt water. That's taken care of by the old brains. These newer parts actively generate things like curiosity. What you might broadly call the forebrain is where you really solve problems, accomplish abstract thinking, and do tough stuff. It actually looks at uncertainty and goes, well, that's new and interesting. I want to figure this out. I actually want to take this uncertain thing and turn it into something I understand, something I can be certain of. So in a really general sense, there are these various parts of your brain that, for very different reasons, are kind of working to the same goal of pushing you away from uncertainty toward certainty. And they're both talking at you whenever you face new challenges. Most of the time they're talking at completely unequal volumes, and that can result in some complex and contradictory feelings about trying something new and unknown. I want to do this, but it freaks me out a little, is a thought everyone has had 1,000 times and will continue to have. And you've probably seen all sorts of philosophies and psychologies trying to sort out the confusion there. Quotes about staying the course, or fighting fear, or you being an awesome you despite what the haters say. And there's like a picture of a mouse staring down an owl with evil eyes or whatever. So when both of those sides are talking or shouting at you, you know that several parts of your brain agree there's something there that you don't know how to deal with just yet. You're getting challenged, in other words. So you can take that as pretty solid confirmation that you've been presented with an opportunity to discover something, to expand yourself in some way. Now, that's not to say that when you feel like you're dangling over a cliff, that it's easy to get yourself to just lean into it for the sake of finding something out. That instinctual fear of falling can be really strong. Or that when you're lost in the swamp and your brain just will not shut up about how much it sucks to be slogging through this muck with no end in sight, that it's in any way easy to keep your feet moving, because of course it's not, for anyone. But it helps to remember why your brain is screaming all that noise. There's probably some very slight fear of the unknown there. That fear is an attempt to protect you. That's what fear does. That's the whole point of it. For better and worse, that's its job. And there's probably also frustration that you haven't gotten through to the other side yet, that you haven't broken through the unfamiliarity and found the solution to your curiosity or reached some certainty about it. Both of those emotions might be pounding you at the same time, and it may leave you doubting or fed up or just exhausted. And that tends to make you not want to do it, or to do something else that's more familiar and not quite as challenging. And that's okay, that's how it works. For better and worse, it's that way by design, for everyone. The measure of your passion for something is whether you make that slog through the swamp anyway to get to the dry land at the other end. You know you want to get there, you just don't always want to deal with all the struggle and internal conflict. This is a pretty general and pervasive obstacle we all have to deal with to different degrees just in life. But as it relates specifically to making stuff, when you don't push through that obstacle, you may go through long periods where you repeat yourself a lot in your work, and you don't get a whole lot better over time. Because you stay in the safe zone, you stick with what you know. You don't really take challenges on with enough determination to have any good breakthroughs, so there's just not a lot of progress. So the awesome part of this is that you can actively spot opportunities for progress just by listening to what your brain is telling you to feel frustrated by or to run from. And then you can intentionally go toward those opportunities. And you can spot when you are learning, when you can already feel that doubting, frustrating slog in between not getting it and getting it. And what's even cooler is that tapping your sense of play is key to getting through that swamp. And as a creative person, you're already way more capable of play than the average person, so you're kind of in a prime position. True, when you're already struggling, it's a little harder to free yourself up to that mentality of play, but there are a few simple points you can refer to help you find it. First, and this is pretty obvious, but totally critical, real play is not serious. And that's important because design definitely has an analytical component to it, and parts where you're really just working in service to an external goal you may not have a huge amount of say in. There's the assessment part toward the front end of any project, and the production part toward the back end. And they're probably both driven by certain demands, like the client's need or a deadline. But in moments between those, play is the part where you wander around, exploring the territory, just for the sake of exploring it. It's the part where you try things, discover, and enjoy the actual process. Where you say, I want to do this, so I'm gonna. Which leads to the second, which is that play is about the process, not the goal. It's about the doing of it in the present, the exploration. It's not about the completion of the game, it's about the playing of the game. When you decide you've won or lost the game, the playing is over. So the key to play is to keep inventing new games. Mostly they're really small games that change from moment to moment. I'm gonna put something behind this guy. Let's try this. Interesting. Now I wonder if I can make it really contrast its surroundings. You just keep making up games as long as you're curious and interested. Third, you need rules, but rules without consequence. Again, nothing serious. Simple or complex, and it doesn't matter where they come from as long as you think they make it interesting. Games have rules to give them structure, and structure creates challenge, which is what makes it interesting to play and explore in the first place. The rules can be as simple as saying, add something geometric here, or as complex as try to associate this guy with some kind of ethos through a nondescript insignia or modernized coat of arms. Design already inherently comes with some very basic rules in place. Make an image on a screen inside of this rectangle and it should mean something. The additional rules we have here, the structure, is a guide. I'm presenting you with a very specific structure to explore and play in. And you're naturally deciding which of the challenges that come out of that are interesting to you and which aren't. And you're playing your own way through each one, testing boundaries, exploring, trying things out. In working on the exercises in the first couple of chapters, no one told you to make exactly what you did. You agreed to some structure for making and explored your way through it because you were a creative person at play. And then lastly, play isn't stressful. It might be exciting, but it's not stressful. It's like taking an unknown back road just to see what it's like and where it goes. You might have somewhere you're meant to be headed, but you're taking an unhurried moment to do something just to do it. And you never know what you might find out there. Part of what's great about this whole project is the opportunity to really play. You can slam up against that wall of frustration if you really want to, if you're into masochism. I'm not judging you, weirdo. Or you can cultivate the mentality of play that's less goal-oriented and more about exploration for its own sake.
Okay, here, hold my stuff. I've always wanted to try this.
In reality, it's going to be a mix of both, but I'm talking about cultivating a play mindset because that's where most of the creative growth happens. Sometimes it'll be easier, sometimes the task's smaller and the benefits larger. Breakthroughs seemingly more achievable. That's great, eat those up. They're like gifts. Because as you know, sometimes it'll be harder, and that's when it really helps to remember these two things. First, to listen to how your brain is railing against it. Are you frustrated? Are you doubting? Your brain is trying to protect you from the unknown and keep you in the safe zone. That's not a reason to hate your brain. It's doing its best. And you know what? It's pretty goddamn good at a lot of things. Well, okay, most people. You know what? Not everyone's brain is all that good. And second, if you are struggling, just play for a bit. Give yourself the opportunity to shake off all the goal-oriented nonsense. Set aside trying to achieve some greater outcome. Gift yourself a moment to do something not in service of a deadline and not in service of a brief. Maybe you'll keep the results, maybe you won't. The results really aren't the point in the moment.
I did a play about Mark Rothko, and his assistant at that time wrote this little thing which it was about being a pictorial artist, but he said being an artist is not about talent and all that. It's about the aspiration for perfection with the acknowledgement that you'll never attain it. So it's kind of learning to enjoy the process of aspiring for a perfection that you won't ever get.
A project may absolutely feel like a battle sometimes. When it does, resort to play. Play is the polar opposite of a battle. A battle's like a dead serious, hyper goal-oriented matter of life and death. You do it so that you don't get smashed to bits. But you play for no other reason than that you'd like to right then. That right in that moment, you want to explore the possibilities of some tiny thing. To entertain your own bite-sized ideas. In the long run, taking time to play eventually builds up a collection of discoveries you can take with you moving forward. You're kind of accidentally building a skill set just by trying lots of stuff and naturally hanging on to what you like. For your creative life, that's what learning looks like. So when you're apprehensive about diving in, you know that means there's an opportunity to explore something and to learn, so keep going. When you feel like you can't do something, that's when you're about to learn. Definitely keep going. When you're in the middle and it's frustrating, you are learning. Keep going. When you make something and it's, useless, you're learning then too. Give yourself a pat on the back and then keep going. As far as I'm concerned, this whole process is play. We have some games with their rules, and we enter into them at will because we already like doing this stuff, so there's joy in the doing, and there's really no consequences attached. Each one of these pieces is a collection of moments of play. I was out in relatively unfamiliar territory, and sometimes there was more exploration, sometimes less. I definitely could have kept drilling in this spot until I found gold, like on this one where I wandered for a while until I caught an idea and then rode it hard. Drilling relentlessly will work, eventually, if you've got the stamina. But again, another strategy is to wander off for a moment and drill somewhere else, just to see what that's like, to try a whole different path through the swamp. Then again, it's not a sure thing. When you're out in the unknown, nothing is a guarantee. So I started over and basically grabbed an idea from the first round and then immediately made a random series of terrible color combo choices. Sometimes you take a flying leap off your own beaten path and you land in mud. And you're like, I just bought these shoes. It went up my pants and everything. You know what? It's all right. No one's watching. I figured I'd already wandered out past the brink and I'd just keep drilling. So I stuck to this layout. I kept the shapes in their positions and instead decided to push the colors as far from where they were as I could think to, and brought in more of that texture and brushed in some brighter values and some darker values, kind of acting like highlights and shadows and even a bit like glows. In the end, I'd say in all fairness, this is a pretty comfortable approach for me. It's not a huge stretch for me to use black and white with some accent colors and then paint in lighting cues to get some depth. But also in fairness, this is a decent spread of attempts. And in looking at where I did stretch and find something new, these two kind of stuck out a bit. But I thought this one could still benefit from pushing the contrast a little harder, so I tore into it again, thinking about trying to heighten the value contrast along these edges to help define these shapes more. Just playing, really. Echoing these shapes and doubling up on those echoes, which starts creating a little more density of detail around those edges. Furthering that value contrast by bringing the colors down elsewhere to help their colors pop even more. And then noticing that the scales of these two halves of the arrow are exactly the same. Just shifting that balance so one is definitely bigger than the other, creating that contrast and scale between the two halves. Without spending too much time, just really trying to create areas of more significant density, mainly around these more colorful shapes, and more contrast in scale overall. You could imagine pushing all this stuff in the upper right even closer together and further out toward this corner to increase the density and that contrast in scales just a bit more. And the differences here aren't huge, but now the original does feel flatter by comparison, a little more lifeless. And your eye probably wants to look at this one a little longer than this one, even if only by a small margin. And that's something you can easily get just by asking yourself, could this aspect of my image do with a little more of a certain contrast? Can I push it a little further? Yeah, the answer is probably yes. So looking at the set, I'd say that's a success. And these in particular are kind of exciting for me personally because I found out a few things I can keep working with and probably will. And that's what you're really hoping for. It's a winding, forking path you're taking with no particular destination. And it really is one of those cases where it's the journey that matters most. You're enjoying the trip and trying to pick up little experiences to take with you while you keep moving. That's really one of the joys of being an artist in the first place, right? You can always keep moving forward because there is no penultimate goal where you sit and think, I've done it, I've finished all of art. So I'm really glad this round turned out like this. We've got some good stuff and some stuff that makes me want to throw up a little in my mouth and then have to swallow it again, but there were honest attempts to forge a bit of new territory. It's a pretty good example of the process as a whole. The bonus for you is that you don't ever have to show anyone your results if you don't want to, whereas for me, you've seen it already. Now, the reason we took a minute to explore how our brains deal with new challenges and uncertainty in various ways is twofold. First, when you really start slamming up against a challenge, like what you think are the limitations of working with just circles or squares, it's good to be able to remember why you get frustrated or procrastinating or anxious or excited or whatever you end up going through. It can kind of help you go, yeah, I hear you, brain. Your concerns have been duly noted. Thank you. And then forge right ahead as it continues to lodge new complaints with its own highly committed HR department.
If I look back, I think some of my more successful things, in my point of view, have been the things I've been most nervous about and probably most unsure when I began. There's something about jumping off that cliff, which means you end up going for broke and probably end up taking a few more risks, if you know what I mean.
The second reason is that we're about to launch into territory that, depending on your background, might very well be exactly that kind of challenge. You might initially be better or worse at it, and now you're freshly reminded of why you might be fielding those kinds of mental complaints while digging into this phase, and what you can do to help yourself along the way. Hopefully that gives you a little extra boost, because for all other reasons, this phase is actually really fun. For this phase, there's no time restriction. And we're going to open it up some more and use any or all of the 3 shapes you want to. But we're going to make some forms and shapes freehand. Now that means if you have a Wacom or a stylus of some kind, that's cool. But what's even better is one of these and some of this. And maybe one of these. Or these. Little of this. Honestly, anything you can make a mark with on any surface you think is interesting. Yes. Uh-huh. That'd be rad.
Oh, yeah!
Okay, maybe not. All right, let's not get carried away. We're still not really looking to generate recognizable imagery yet, illustrations, icons, or whatever. We're just mining for the formal qualities of some gestural, handmade things. In all likelihood, that means generating some textures you can use, and it also means exploring a range of line qualities. Now, there's a huge range of line qualities, just like textures. And it's probably pretty obvious how that works, but it's worth it to really remember to think about line quality. The quality of lines is really only a special case because they're so ubiquitous in art. Our eyes are designed to find the edges of things, so visual art heavily utilizes edges and lines to describe shapes. Without even thinking about it, we're attuned to how those edges look and behave, and what they convey as a result. So line quality really is a tool to bear in mind. Even when you may not intentionally be creating what you'd call line work, you're almost entirely likely going to have some edges at the very least. And when you are doing actual line work, settings like stroke width and straightness or curviness are pretty useful in defining the qualities of lines. But it's pretty easy sitting in a computer to forget that your options extend way beyond length and stroke width and straight or curvy. A line made with a real brush feels and really conveys something much different than a line made with this brush, right? You can play with contrasting values, but you can also play with differing textures. In fact, the whole contrast toolbox is at your disposal here. What's more, a single line can contain contrasts within it that help give it variation along its length or draw attention from here to there. Like modulation, meaning thicks and thins along its length. Or maybe it simply starts straight and then bends, or curves in on itself entirely, or is altogether erratic. All this stuff is really similar to the other basic contrasts, just applied to edges or lines. You know, modulation is really just a contrast in scale from here to there. So of course you can have contrast within a line and contrast between two lines. In the scale or the color or value of one versus another. You can even change the scale of each to sort of optically affect the overall value. Texture, density, all this stuff is totally relevant, and that's pretty straightforward. The point, like for most of these things, is to be able to keep these things in mind so we can consciously work with them. So they're really in the toolbox. We could have 5 contrasts instead of 6, but again, lines and edges are in everything that's not total mush. So they're in almost everything you might make, and it's really helpful to be aware of their effect. That's really going to play out in the challenge that we're about to do.
On balance, off balance, doesn't matter. I'm better than you are, yeah.
But this phase, more than any so far, really needs a quick warm-up. You're going to use significant fine motor skills for this, which is, it's more akin to a performance. So like playing any kind of sport or music or, breakdance battles, obviously. And all these things go way better when you're warmed up. Somehow I'm still surprised when I sit down to try to draw something or even just to scratch something out and it looks like shit. And then after 20 or 30 minutes of using my hands, it starts coming out so much better just from being a little warmed up. And the warm up we're going to do is really simple, but I'll bet you exactly $1 billion you'll suck at it at first. That's why we're doing it. Get out a few pieces of paper you can make an embarrassing mess of and then immediately throw away because this ain't going to be a keepsake. And get a pencil or a pen of some kind. Then here's the crazy part. Put the pencil on the paper. I know, right? You didn't see that coming. Now, you're going to draw 2 points, maybe 4 or 5 inches apart from each other. Then freehand draw a smooth, perfectly straight line from the first point to the second. Can't do it, can you? Yeah, you're human. It's not that easy. Quick tip if you rarely do any drawing, a faster stroke is a smoother stroke. And swinging your arm from the shoulder and elbow instead of your wrist allows for bigger, smoother sweeps. So try that. And whip out about 10 lines from point to point, trying to get smoother and straighter each time. Then make 2 more points at a little bit of an angle to those first 2. And without turning the paper, do it again. Keep doing that at increasing angles without turning the paper until you basically get a set of sketchy perspective lines. Just over the course of a few minutes, your hand will kind of start to warm up. So you're good to go now, right? Wrong! Flip that page over and I dare you I double dare you, motherfucker, to draw an oval. Terrible! Do it again and again. Again, I love repetition. Draw squat ones and draw rounder ones and just keep going over the same lines until you start laying some good looking eggs. This really is like singers doing pre-show vocal exercises. Or basketball players taking warm-up shots before the game. Illustrators frequently do warm-up sketches because they all know it takes a bit to really turn it on. It's no different here. You just get nicer marks, nicer lines, nicer elements overall when your muscles are loosened up and your head is really talking to your hand. So let yourself have a few unstructured minutes of making complete garbage until you start feeling a little more fluid. The quality of what you make by hand afterwards will just be so much higher. Give that a crack. Maybe it's 10 minutes for you. Maybe you need more like 30 until it doesn't feel so unnatural. But try starting with this stuff using just a pencil or pen. And then when you're a little looser, start pulling out some other materials. Charcoal, brushes, inks, different kinds of paper. Spray paint on your neighbor's car if you want. You can tell him I told you it was cool. Make some marks and really look at the different sorts of textures you can get. The line qualities. Are they rough, smooth, patchy, chunky, aggressive, playful, broken, messy, patterned? And if you see something cool already coming out, you can grab some of this stuff afterward for your frames, but there's plenty of opportunity for that. So don't feel like any of this is meant to be used. These really are just practice shots. No one's keeping score. Start with the pencil warm-up. Do it until you're starting to loosen up, and then feel free to generally explore a bit, and we'll come back and we'll do something cool with that. All right, make that mess!
Please flip the cassette over to side B to continue the adventure.
And welcome back. All right, so for this chapter, we're going to do 5 frames with all access to circles, triangles, and squares, and a real focus on making some elements by hand, trying out a few different physical media and looking for interesting line qualities and textures in what you get out of it. Feel free to make perfect shapes in software, or to draw them by hand, or to make any other handmade marks you like and use them however you want. Maybe that means drawing some simple lines, or exploring some color washes, or focusing on generating textural elements. Just simple stuff, no iconography or what you might think of as illustrations. Just simple marks and textures. And if you try out some mediums you haven't before, and I think you definitely should, give yourself some time to play with them. Like watercolor is an interesting medium with lots of really cool techniques available, and you get something totally different if you dip a dampened brush onto a dry, crackly chunk of watercolor ink and then drag what you pick up across dry paper than you do if you touch an ink-loaded brush to a really wet spot on watercolor board. And it's different again if you flick that ink off of an old toothbrush. You don't have to turn your desk into a laboratory and try to do something that's never been done before, but it's worth giving yourself enough freedom to really make a bit of a mess. Now, there are a couple pathways for making the frames themselves. The first is to start your composition on paper, figure it out mostly there, and then bring it into Photoshop and add whatever digital elements or effects you want, if any. Then, of course, the second is to start in the software, roughly lay out the sort of composition you're going for, and then make and import the individual handmade elements you want to add to it. They'll each lead to different outcomes. You can do this in phases, too. So maybe you want to throw more of a sketching phase in there where you plan the basic layout in an app or on paper, and then go about generating some elements by hand, and then finish in Photoshop. Maybe you want to start with some reference images, sketch out something inspired by them, work it up in Photoshop, and apply textural elements where appropriate. Feel free to mix and match which you do by hand and which on screen. And then taking an evenly lit picture of your handmade stuff with your phone is a pretty simple way to import it, although if you do it that way, you may find that you want to work larger so that the camera can pick up those nice little details. And then you can get it into the computer however you want. It's easy to just text or email it to yourself. In the olden days, you used to have to use a scanner, and that's actually, it's still the best for this if you have access to one, because the resolution is fantastic. And that means you can work small if you like, which opens you up to details you just can't get otherwise. Before scanners, it was like these gigantic photo rigs, and before that is prehistory, and we'd have no record because presumably that was in the time of the cave people, and all the internet archives from that era are sadly lost to antiquity. Now, we're still making stuff that doesn't intentionally have much meaning, if any at all, but with the addition of color, and now with handmade textures and a wide variety of line qualities, mood or tone is really going to start becoming more apparent. So it may actually work to your benefit if you take charge of that fact and work with color palettes and media that can complement each other to create a significant mood, even in the absence of any other particular meaning. Or you may find that forcing that too hard makes it feel contrived or cliche. Really, whatever appeals to you, but of course, be aware of the kind of mood or tone that seems to be developing, if any, and see if you can latch onto it and develop it further. Alright, so use any or all of the basic shapes made in the box or made by hand. Use any colors you want, generated by hand or by software. Use any lines or marks or textures you want, as long as you make those only by hand. Then you can manipulate, stretch, blur, paint over, colorize, fill, chop, mask, get naked and rob a check cashing place. The constraints are busting pretty wide open at this point, and really only exclude things like photography or found objects or doing anything in 3D. It's all about what you can make from scratch, so go hog wild. You and I will probably go in very different directions, and depending on your familiarity with working this way, you may either be stoked or a little apprehensive about this one. If you're feeling a little procrastinating or anxious about diving in, rest assured your brain is just doing its job as it's meant to do. Thank you, brain, for protecting me, but no one's going to be maimed or die here, so we're going to give this a real healthy shot, despite all of your very well-intentioned protests. Now, you may bust through these effortlessly, or you may stall out at some point. Totally understandable either way. You've already done a bunch so far, and that may be energizing or it may be sapping. If you find yourself stalling out, remember to make some big moves. Do something wildly random in the frame, or step away for a bit and do something totally unrelated and come back to it and then make a big change to something you've done. And get dirty. Make some mistakes. You don't get many chances in your career to really play like this without repercussions for wasting time or resources. So I hope you get in there and try some things out. Keep those ideas of working with contrasts in mind and let them play out however you like. But since we're just going to do 5 of these, and the first few might take you a little longer to get in the groove, don't feel like they necessarily need to be complex. Keep them simple if you want. Or go nuts, whatever, I'm not your mom! Take as much time as you like making elements and putting together compositions. I'm gonna go try comboing some handmade stuff with some digital stuff and see what comes out. Hopefully I'll embarrass myself some more for your sake. All right, get into it. Have fun. See you soon.